It started with a sip. A familiar taste, sweet, fizzy, a little cold. Just a bottle of Coca-Cola passed around at lunch, like always. Then a cough. Then a second. By the time the bell rang at St. Mary's School in Bornem, Belgium, children were holding their stomachs, crying out in pain. Some vomited, some fainted. One girl slumped against her desk and didn't get back up. Within minutes, panic erupted across the classroom. By the end of the day, more than 30 students had been rushed to local hospitals. Emergency rooms filled with children, all showing the same signs: nausea, dizziness, blurred vision, abdominal cramps, and in some cases, fainting spells. Some were hyperventilating. Others were curled up, unable to speak. A few were in shock. And every single one of them, it seemed, had just drunk Coca-Cola. At first, it looked like an isolated event. One bad batch, maybe, a contaminated shipment. But within hours, calls started coming in from other towns. Dozens of schools were reporting the same thing, in Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp, in small villages and major cities alike. Hundreds of students all getting sick, all after consuming Coke products, some bottled, some canned. Within 48 hours, the number of reported cases had surged past 250. A week later, that number passed 1,000. Belgium was in crisis, and Coca-Cola was at the center of it. At first, the company downplayed the incident, issuing a cautious statement, saying they were cooperating with authorities and investigating the cause. But behind the scenes, chaos was unfolding. Distribution centers were flooded with return requests. Supermarkets began pulling Coke products from their shelves. Parents were calling the media. Schools were shutting down entire cafeterias. The symptoms were eerily consistent. Most children fell ill within minutes of consuming Coke. The signs were sudden and dramatic. The media dubbed it the Coca-Cola school poisoning. Newspapers ran it across their front pages. Television anchors spoke in grave tones. News helicopters hovered over factories and hospitals. Parents refused to send their children to school. People weren't just scared, they were furious. The government stepped in. The Belgian health ministry ordered a full investigation. Coke executives in Brussels were summoned for urgent meetings. The French government imposed a temporary ban on all Coca-Cola products coming from affected factories. Luxembourg followed suit. The recall was massive. Over 30 million bottles and cans were pulled from shelves in Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. It became the largest product recall in Coca-Cola's entire history. It wasn't just the public's trust that was slipping. It was Coca-Cola's grip on the European market. Behind closed doors, Coke's internal teams were scrambling. Engineers tested batch samples. Safety officers traced logistics records. Public relations teams crafted emergency statements. Their initial reports pointed to two possible sources. One, the Dunkirk, France facility. Pallets used to ship soda cans had been treated with a fungicide, likely containing phenol or a similar chemical compound. In hot, humid conditions, these pallets could release gases, which, when trapped under the shrink wrap used to seal soda pallets, might interact with the can's outer coating. If those vapors crept under the pop tabs, they could contaminate the drink itself, or at least affect the smell. The second culprit was the Antwerp bottling plant. There, a shipment of carbon dioxide, used to carbonate bottled Coke, had tested positive for trace levels of hydrogen sulfide. It's the same compound that gives rotten eggs their odor. It's also a known gastrointestinal irritant. It seemed they had their answer, only it didn't quite add up. Independent toxicologists were quick to point out that while the contaminants might explain the strange taste and smell, the concentration levels were far too low to account for the severe symptoms reported. Not just nausea, but fainting, loss of vision, hyperventilation, collapse. Even more concerning, tests on many of the recalled cans showed no trace of contamination whatsoever. And yet, children were still getting sick. In some cases, even students who hadn't drunk any Coke at all. Something else was happening. And scientists were beginning to suspect the unthinkable. Mass psychogenic illness, otherwise known as mass hysteria. It's a phenomenon where psychological stress triggers physical symptoms: headaches, nausea, dizziness, even fainting. It's not faked, it's real. But it's not caused by a toxin or a disease. It spreads through suggestion, fear, and social contagion. In group settings like schools, where children see their friends collapse, panic can spread faster than any virus. Once the idea takes root, the Coke is poisoned. The body can respond as if it's true, especially in children whose minds are more vulnerable to suggestion. It was an uncomfortable theory. No one wanted to tell families that their kids weren't really poisoned. No one wanted to hear that the nation's most trusted brand had caused a psychological crisis, not a chemical one. But the more data that came in, the more it pointed that way. The children in Bornem may have genuinely reacted to the hydrogen sulfide, perhaps the smell, perhaps an interaction with something they ate. That first group's symptoms could have been physical, but the sheer scale of the outbreak, the speed with which it spread, the number of unconfirmed cases, it didn't fit the pattern of toxic exposure. By the second week, Coke's leadership was under fire. Douglas Ivester, the company's CEO, personally flew to Belgium to deliver a public apology. But it was too little, too late. Supermarkets weren't restocking. Sales dropped by over 90% in Belgium and nearly 50% across France. Coke's European division was hemorrhaging. Its market share was crumbling. Employees were being threatened. Delivery trucks were vandalized. One distributor in Brussels reported being chased out of a school parking lot by angry parents. In the eyes of the public, the company had poisoned children and then failed to protect them. Even after testing showed most drinks were safe, the stigma remained. Because by then, it wasn't about facts. It was about fear. Parents didn't trust science. They trusted what they saw. And what they saw were ambulances in schoolyards, children screaming, doctors whispering, news anchors panicking. The truth had become irrelevant. The damage was done. In the months that followed, Coca-Cola launched an aggressive recovery campaign. Free samples, school programs, factory tours. They revamped their transportation protocols, banned chemical-treated pallets, and improved their lot tracking systems. But their image was bruised. Douglas Ivester resigned under pressure before the end of the year. The company lost tens of millions in revenue, and perhaps more in reputation. As the dust settled, health agencies quietly concluded the investigation. They confirmed that the chemical contaminants in a small number of Coke products might have triggered the initial symptoms. But the vast majority of cases were likely caused by psychogenic illness, a collective trauma born from stress, suggestion, and media amplification. It was a bizarre, terrifying moment in consumer history, because it showed just how quickly a product trusted by billions could turn toxic in the public mind. One small chemical mistake, one fearful classroom, and the whole country turned. Even years later in Belgium, the event is remembered not as a health scare, but as a turning point in how people view corporate responsibility. It was no longer enough for a product to be safe. It had to feel safe. It had to be trusted. And once that trust is lost, no chemical test can win it back. For Coca-Cola, the school poisoning was a nightmare. For Belgium, it was a trauma. And for the rest of the world, it was a warning. That fear can be just as poisonous as anything that comes in a bottle. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.